Hi, this is Gage from Why God Why. We're in the midst of a season titled The Credibility of Christianity, and we are diving into all types of topics like faith and science, politics, diversity, faith and beauty or superficiality, and more. And as we go through this season, we want to hear from you. We're going to do an episode at the very end of the season where we discuss the whole season and respond to listener questions. So as you listen along and you think, hey, I wish they talked about that question further, or they didn't really hit on this topic related to the episode, we'd love to hear from you and get a chance to discuss it together. So as you're listening along, if that occurs to you, send your question you'd like us to discuss to peter@browncroft.org. If you're extra savvy, send us a recording of your voice actually asking the question, and we can include that in the episode. We'll only share your name if you give us permission, but we'd love to hear from you. With that, enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Why God Why podcast. We have an exciting episode for you today, jumping into a series we're calling The Credibility of Christianity. There are many things about the Christian faith that for many of us, and some of you, maybe even on your journeys, there's things that can take away from the credibility of it. And there's things that can actually strengthen our faith. So we're diving into some of those topics, some of those harder questions that are sometimes tough to wrestle through, tough to deal with. And one today that we are jumping right into is the credibility of Christianity. Why are Christians afraid of science? There you go. And with me, it's me, Aaron McGinnis, student director here at Browncroft. I have with me
John Amayo, that's my name.
John, and our special guest.
Yes, Dr. Steve Pelton. Yes, we are so glad to have you here with us. Welcome to the Hair Club for Men podcast. We're so glad to have, why God, why, sorry.
I love it.
Yeah.
A little bit of a shine here.
That's right.
A little bit of a shine. For those of you just listening, just imagine a glorious shine coming from the three of us.
Right. Yes.
Great, all great men come out on top is what my uncle used to say.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, man. Nice. I love it. Yep. Well, yeah, so we're going to be diving in today, hearing about Dr. Pelton's story. And I know for me, this is personally a topic I'm very interested in. I was just telling these guys, if you were to look at my YouTube history, at least a third of it is science videos, from physics to, I like a lot of physics, I'm going to be honest. I do. And in that realm, I've watched Christian YouTubers, Christian scientists, and non-Christian ones as well. And I also know that this can be a really conflicting topic. I've seen videos of people deconstructing over, whatever it may be, the viability of the flood, or what is creation really like, evolution. I've seen those conversations be really difficult for people. So yeah, I'm excited to jump into it today. John, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling great about this because we get to talk with someone who I really have come to know and respect over the years. Dr. Pelton has been in medicine now for 50 years. He was just telling us before we hit record here. So that's a big deal. And he's in the science world for a lot of his life. He uses science as a part of his day in and day out, as well as I think this is a passion of his. So I'm excited not only to hear from him, but to learn from him as well, because I think he has walked this journey for a long time, and it's a passion of his. So welcome, Dr. Steve Pelton. Great to have you here with us. And maybe we'll just start out by asking you, how did science become a passion of yours? When did this really take root for you as a person? Do you remember?
Well, I think in my high school biology class, I thought this is kind of neat. It's kind of fun. And so I started thinking about it, back in those days. And I thought that I'd probably like to go into medicine. And so that was my goal when I started college.
Nice. Yeah. Now, growing up, did you have role models? Was this something that you were out in the woods looking at things? Or where did that?
No. In fact, I think I was the first person in my family to go to college.
Wow.
And no, I think it was high school biology that made me interested in living things. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it'd be nice to and medicine seemed like a reasonable thing to do. It seemed like it would be fun to do. It would be interesting. And so I started college as a pre-med student and didn't look back.
Wow.
Went to Houghton College.
Yeah.
I majored in zoology. Mm. I met my wife at Houghton.
Okay.
And then from there went to medical school. Went to Cornell Medical School in New York City.
Yeah.
And we were members of Calvary Baptist Church down there in New York City, which some people may be familiar with. Then I did a year of internal medicine and neurology at the University of Virginia. We call it an internship. And then I went to Boston University for 3 years and did my dermatology residency there. And we were members of Park Street Church there, which some people may know, may not. Park Street Church is, we were just in Boston a couple years ago with two of our grandchildren, and it's funny, Boston is so different than it used to be, but here is a big city with huge high-rises, and right in the middle, right on Boston Common is Old Park Street Church, and it's still there, and I've got a picture of it, and I think, here is a witness for Christ in the middle of this new modern remade Boston, and it was called Brimstone Corner because during the War of 1812, I think they stored gunpowder in the basement. It wasn't because of the preaching; it was because of the gunpowder in the basement.
Wow!
And then we moved to Rochester. My wife grew up in Buffalo, and I grew up west of Batavia. So we thought we'd like to come close to where our family was, and Rochester seemed to be a good place. So we came here and joined Brighton Community Church back in those days, and been here ever since.
Wow! That sounds like quite a journey, because you're describing your journey in medicine, obviously, and science, a huge part of that. But you're also describing your journey of faith in that as well. This seemed to be going side by side, even as you're describing it. You're describing both sides at the same time, which sometimes, that's not always the case for everybody, where both of these things are in place and you're working through both of them at the same point. Did you ever find in that journey, as you were growing in both areas, did you ever hit points at which you were like, man, I'm having a tough time figuring out how these two things fit together? Or or were there questions that arose that you're like, I don't think I'm getting adequate answers for these questions, maybe in the spaces that I'm...
Now, the questions of faith and science? Particularly?
Yeah, like of faith in the scientific community or science in the faith community. I think sometimes we see these things as, maybe what I'm trying to get to is, sometimes we see these things as diametrically opposed to each other, but I don't think they have to be.
No, there was... he's the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard. He's famously quoted as saying that science and faith are in separate magisteria. It's called the non-overlapping magisteria, and it's a very famous quote. So his idea was that these two things were separate. But I think if you talk to any scientist or someone who uses science that is a Christian, they will say that's certainly not true. In one of the books that I have there, Dr. Andrew Steen, who's a physicist over at Oxford, I think, he doesn't have those circles like that. He has a circle of faith, and within it is science. And arts and things like this. And I think that's true. I think if you talk to people who are scientists and are Christians, say, well, no, I'm fine with both of them. They both, one enhances the other. When you look at the James Webb Telescope, the pictures that came from that. when you look at one of the first ones where they pointed to a part of the sky that was no bigger than a grain of sand, and you see all the galaxies out there, and you think to yourself, oh, who could have done this? And then you look at, you look at the immune system, how complicated it is, how well it works. Who could have done this? And then something that I know nothing about, except I trust people, about quantum physics and all the craziness. And how could that be? Who could have done all this? And to me, science just helps my faith. It just makes me wonder, who could have done this? And no wonder God said in the second commandment, don't make an idol of me, of any living creature, because how could you even conceive of a being that could do that?
Right.
How could you even conceive of that?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it's you talk and I'm like, oh, it's so good. And I also can imagine people being almost confused. They're like, all right, from what I've seen, maybe even Christians I know, or the churches, or the things put out by the church, it feels like they almost don't want you to wonder. Like, this is our set of beliefs. It's much more comfortable to stay within this. If anything kind of moves outside what we've traditionally known, it's got to be false. And I think I've heard people talk about that side of Christianity before, and where that idea of wonder and, oh man, like, let's do research. Let's like pour in and look at what's actually happening. They would think, wait, I thought that'd be a scary point for Christians because one, isn't it just all about faith? What you don't see, right, is one of the things. Like, that's how that's what I've heard. So what would you say to that? This idea that, wait a second, I've seen Christianity as a place where that doesn't allow you to wonder. Yeah.
Well, it certainly makes me wonder. I don't quite know how to answer it other than what I just said, but it's just an enhancement of my faith, and it makes me sad to think that there are some Christians who don't trust science.
Yeah, expound on that, because I think that's that right there is what you've just said is very poignant. It makes you sad that there are some Christians who don't trust science. Yeah.
I think we have to say that we're talking here about American evangelicals.
Right. Right. And so let's look at that subset. We can speak to it because we're part of that subset, so we can.
We're in the tribe.
Yeah, we can.
But Catholics have no problem. Episcopalians have no problems with it. Europeans who are evangelicals have no problems. Distrust of science is a large part of, or is largely American evangelicals. Not all. Certainly not all. I don't mean that.
Right.
But it is an issue. And according to one of the authors, Dr. Janet Kellogg-Ray, she said it's really primarily in three areas that she sees the distrust. She's an educator as well as a scientist. Mistrust in climate science.
Okay, yeah.
Mistrust in COVID, the science and the vaccines and that sort of thing. And then evolution. Now, the first two, there is so much political that's associated with it. There's so much in the media. There's so much social media, stuff that you see on TV and listen. That's very complicated, and it's not. That's a harder thing to talk about, and you'd almost have to have a whole podcast just on that.
You could have a whole season.
And I'm not sure I want to do that. But evolution is a little clearer as far as being separate from politics and that sort of thing. And so, evolution has been the big issue for American evangelicals for a long time. I know I was raised in a Christian home, and I was raised with a Schofield Bible. Now, probably neither one of you know
What is the Schofield
have
Bible?
that.
Yeah.
But if you open the Schofield Bible, in Genesis 1, the first page, the date for Genesis 1 up at the top is from Bishop Ussher's dates, 4004 BC.
Nice.
Right. Very distinctive. I mean,
4004.
Yes.
yeah, you could
Add a
prove
leaf.
it. Yeah.
Now, growing up, I didn't think that much of it. And as I grew up in a church. I'm very thankful for the church I grew up in. We were never taught about evolution per se. We were taught you read the Bible. You take it literally unless you read things like, trees don't clap their hands, for example, that sort of thing. So I just sort of assumed that, and I think everyone took it pretty literally, that God created the way it says and so forth and so on. But in high school, I learned some earth science, I learned some biology, and I thought, that's kind of, I'm not sure that that's really true, but it didn't bother me a whole lot. There was this cognitive dissonance here, a little bit, I guess. You sort of observe certain things, but then you believe certain things, and they don't quite line up. But what's the deal? It wasn't affecting my life at all. But I picked up a book probably in my freshman year of college called The Genesis Flood by Morris and Whitcomb. And Henry Morris was a hydraulic engineer, and the whole book was predicated on the idea that all of the geological formations, everything that you find geologically, was due to the flood. And I thought, that's a little odd too, but I didn't think too much of it. Didn't bother me, but I thought that's interesting. In college, I took a genetics course, and we had to write a paper on genetics. And I thought I'd do one on evolution, and I picked up a book by Russell Mixter, who was the chairman of biology at Wheaton College at that time. And he introduced the idea of a theistic evolution. I thought, that's really pretty interesting. I wonder if that's true. But again, who cares? It doesn't really matter. It didn't affect my life at all. And went about my training and, got interested in child rearing and being a good husband and having a career and that sort of thing. So it didn't really affect me all that much. I did get interested a little bit in reading a few things now and again by some of the creation scientists, so-called. But, they would appeal to certain science, and they would say, well, science shows this. And I thought, well, I'm not an expert in this. So who do I trust? So that was one of the first realization that I have to trust somebody to give me information. So who do I choose to trust?
Yeah. Well, that right there is a big statement, what you just said.
Yeah.
Because I feel like for everybody who's listening right now, that's their main issue too.
Yeah.
And
Whether no matter what side no matter what background you're coming from, it's who do I trust to give me the information here? At least.
Yeah, and I know a bunch of friends who have just kind of succumbed to the realization that it's too hard to know who to trust, so I'm just not going to trust anything. I'm going to live in this world where maybe from their perspective it's this way, but really the objective truth, how in the world are we ever going to know? So that trust issue is resolved for them by just completely stepping back from the question. But is that your story?
Well, you step back for a while, but there was a book that was given to me. It's in that pile there, by a biology professor at a Christian university. It was by a man named Darrell Falk. Darrell Falk is a professor of biology, I think, out at Point Loma. Is that a a Christian school out in California. It was called Coming to Peace with Science. And that really changed my whole perspective on things. I mean, that was you look at certain books that change your direction.
Yeah.
That did it. That one did it. It was because he told a story that was sort of like mine. And yet he said, and he gave all the data about the evolution and so forth, and how evolution is not just some thought. It's a fact. And there is so much data and so much information that it really can't be doubted by people doing legitimate science.
So when you even just saying that, so I'm sitting in the fact that you're saying that on a podcast that's a Christian podcast, right? People aren't expecting you to say that.
No, and
on a bunch of different levels, people aren't expecting.
I expect to get criticism for it, but that's
but
all right.
but I want to acknowledge that's the spot that we're in. Is that's it seems like a very controversial statement. Either controversial statement maybe for people inside the church, but for people outside the church, they're like, hold on, somebody goes to the church that is willing to say that? Like, that's intriguing to me. Like, to me, if I'm on the outside, I'm going, let me listen to this guy because maybe I could trust this guy. I don't know.
Yeah. And one of my questions would be is like, I could almost feel a reaction where it's like, well, if you trust in evolution, then you don't trust in the God of the Bible. I feel like I've heard that.
Well, now we can really go down.
Yeah, let's go down the
pathway. The next thing that I picked up though was a book by Dr. Francis Collins. Now, many people don't know who that was. I've mentioned his name to people in my office, and who is he? But Dr. Collins headed the National Institutes of Health for a number of years. He was Dr. Fauci's boss, if technically, I guess. But he headed the Human Genome Project, which mapped the human genome. And what that means is that they mapped the genes, the millions, I don't know how many, of genes that there are in our chromosomes. And it has opened the door for so many treatments, genetic treatments. Just this week, you've probably read about treatment for sickle cell anemia that was based because of mapping the human genome. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them. Right now, if we see someone with a particular syndrome and we wonder, I wonder if it is that syndrome or not, you can probably get a genetic test to see if they have that gene. So, I mean, it's just, but he wrote a book called The Language of God.
Yeah.
And the language of God has become, I think, to people in the Christian science community, the science community of Christians, almost like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's been one of those go-to books. It's influenced more people that I've read and heard of. And so, and he talks about this, and again, he said, the final proof, if there was any need for final proof of the truth of evolution, is the genetic data.
Yeah.
It's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so the question you ask, Aaron, about, can I trust the gospel of the Bible or not? You have now this dilemma, this cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, for those that don't know it, is like something you believe, but then something you see. Like, I believe my father loves me, but my father beats me. So how do I
put those two together?
Put them together. The best example I've heard, Christian-wise, is from Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson, and his thought was this: that on the one hand, the disciples believed that the Messiah was going to be a liberator and a great person. On the other, this is what they believed. What they saw was a man dying as a thief on a cross. Now, how do you resolve that? they couldn't change what they saw. They had to change their concept of what they believed the Messiah was. And I think in this question that you ask, you say, now, science tells us this, but I've kind of believed this. I believe this is how the Bible tells me it happened. Can I change what science is telling me? Well, no. 1% of people say yes. So maybe I should look at how I've interpreted what the Scripture says.
So how has that worked for you? Like, well, how have you come to understand it and for yourself? And obviously you're not speaking for all of Christianity here. You're just speaking for you and how you've learned to blend those together for yourself.
Well, I attended a seminar a number of years ago up at the chapel in Buffalo. And one of the on science and Scripture. There was I think a biochemist from MIT that was there, and I think a geologist from Canada was being Zoomed at the time. And there was a guy named John Walton who was there. Now, John Walton is an Old Testament professor at Wheaton, and he's written a number of books, two of which I have right there, about Genesis and how it's interpreted. Because Genesis first few chapters have not always necessarily been interpreted literally. Augustine didn't. A lot of people don't. And there are so many different ways of interpreting it, metaphorically or symbolically, for example. And so I think, you can get into the weeds about this, but there are ways that one can interpret this, which I think make a great deal of sense. And John Walton's books are great with regard to that. And there are certainly others as well. But
Yeah, so what I'm also hearing you say is the Scriptures are there and they point at truth, but sometimes we, almost in our Western, lens, we look at it and think like, okay, if I took a video camera and just filmed the creation of the world, it's going to look exactly like Genesis 1, and maybe the biblical authors that's not what they were trying to do at all. They were trying to say, they weren't trying to give you a research proposal or a write-up with a thesis. What they were trying to do is connect the dots and say, who is this God?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And science tells you how and what, but it doesn't tell you who or why. And Scripture is telling you who and why. And there is a lot about the milieu of the area in which the people who were reading or hearing the Genesis story were operating in. There was, and I'd never heard that before. But there was a whole culture and what people understood about what the universe was like. They thought it was a dome, a hard dome, and they thought there was water under the earth and above the dome, and there were pillars that supported the earth, all sorts of things. They had a different idea of what the universe was like. But the story in Genesis is about God and about how God, in contrast to the gods of the Romans and so forth, who created man as servants and so forth, God created man to love man. He loved us. And he did he didn't do it for us to serve him. He created us to be in his image, whatever that means. Which is another whole podcast, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
without diving too deep into the weeds, I'm just curious because I've, done some research into this, not extensive, but I've thought of Dr. Hugh Ross. I don't know if you know of him. He kind of takes it from the angle of there's these, Genesis is kind of depicting different stages maybe in which God intervenes, but basically there's these huge chunks of time in which nothing spectacular happens except for creation is going in its own, but then God intervenes and then does something spectacular, and then the next thing happens. Does that viewpoint resonate with you? I'm just asking for myself here more than I am asking
well,
for...
not entirely.
Okay.
But the biologos people
Right.
interact very nicely with the reasons to believe people, and,
Right.
and they disagree, but hey, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's
Also,
fine.
when I'm here, I've also done some things, and I've heard so many different viewpoints,
Right.
even like, what if Adam and Eve were born with age, or the world was created with age? It was millions of years old, but came into. And I'm like, technically, there is space to think that way, but
Right.
it doesn't necessarily knock out who God is, our faith in Him, all of those things. It's not central, and sometimes I feel like the church treats it as central doctrine.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. I mean, we can be Christian brothers and sisters and differ on these things, and I think that's an important thing to say. Is that what you believe about these things doesn't mean that you are not a Christian, or Christians can believe only this.
Right.
I think that let's see, who's it does the studies? Barna has done studies. I think why do young people leave the church when they leave the church? And one of the reasons is science.
Yeah.
And they may be taught that, well, you've got to believe this way, but they get out, go to school, they learn this, and they think, well, boy, that's not true. I don't believe that. Well, maybe the rest of the stuff I believed isn't true either. That seems to be one reason why kids leave the church.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the reasons why we are even talking about this in this podcast, is because we realize there are a bunch of people that either were, have marginal connection to the church, or some of them were raised in the church who were like very disenfranchised because of the way that science was talked about in the church. And they go, I can't mesh these two.
Or they're even told, you can't, like you see evidence that the universe is expanding, which might point to, a creation point, and being told, I want to say this to those of you who are listening, and maybe you've learned a piece of science, you've done some research, and you just think, well, do I have to throw my faith out the window now? Like, can I be a Christian and also observe what I'm observing happening in the scientific communities? I think oftentimes we don't talk about how, this is where I've come, is generally what I'm seeing happening is both Christian and non-Christian scientists uncovering the beauty of the universe and uncovering these beautiful, magnificent things that have been placed there. And instead of being scared at what is the Hubble telescope going to reveal, being actually on the edge of my seat, getting super excited because we're about to learn more about the created world than we ever knew before.
That's right.
And you know what? I bet there's going to be something so majestic about it that is probably going to point to something greater. And so I just want to encourage any of you who are kind of dabbling with that. Maybe you found yourself deep in quantum physics, or I don't know, wherever in evolution. I just want to encourage you and say it's okay to research. I think one of my favorite Bible verses is like something. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it is the glory of men, or something like that, to dig it up or to uncover it. And I often view that scientists are some of the most blessed people because they get to uncover true beauty. And I almost imagine, God up there being like, they did it, they figured it out.
Well, an atheist and a Christian, when they do science, they do it the same way.
Right.
They do it exactly the same way. A Christian shouldn't just say, well, I can't explain this, so God must have done it. You don't do science that way.
God
You
of the
just
gaps.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit about this before we recorded. I think this is important to explain a little bit, even when we talk about science. Like, even to start with that concept of what is it, how does that work? Like, we kind of throw around these terms and we say, oh, science has proven this, or science has proven that, or we can disprove science by this way, but I think you were just describing a little bit of the scientific process for us. I think that was helpful. It's helpful to frame it a little bit that way.
Yeah, people do science in different ways. You can have a bench researcher who is at a bench and doing chemistry, but you can have people that are out digging up rocks. You can have people in rooms doing mathematics. You can have physicians going out and doing clinical research, studying diseases. What does this treatment do for this, et cetera, et cetera. So you do this stuff, and then you either present it at a meeting or you put it in writing and submit it for publication. Now, before it's published, at least in good journals, it's peer reviewed, which means that there are a bunch of other people who are in the same field who will look at the paper that you've submitted and will determine, well, was the study done correctly? Were the was there some prejudice ahead of time, et cetera, et cetera? And if it passes peer review, then it gets published. When it's published, people read it and criticize maybe or not criticize. And then if it can be reproduced by someone else, then it tends to become part of the scientific consensus after a period of time. If it's reproducible, if it predicts things that it should predict, et cetera, it becomes part of the consensus of science. And that's kind of how these things have worked. That's how evolution has worked. I mean, that there is a consensus of science at this point. If 99% of scientists, when asked if evolution is true, they say yes. Now, this includes scientists who are Christians, scientists who are in Christian colleges, etc. There's 1% that says no. But and what they will try to do with this thing that we talked about before, trying to, do I have to adjust my belief or what I observe in science? The 1% will try to say, well, yeah, but the science, you're incorrectly interpreting this, but that just hasn't worked. That just hasn't worked.
Gotcha.
So the consensus is real. I mean, it's there. And I'm not the expert, but I believe the consensus until it changes.
There you go. There you go. Well, yeah. So what would you say to somebody who is in the midst of this process? I mean, I guess that's one of the questions that I have is like, let's say there's probably a good chunk of people who are listening to this because it's a dialogue about faith and science together. So let's talk specifically to the person who is outside of the community of faith, who is saying, I'm intrigued by the way you approach science, but I don't know if I can believe there's a God. Let's say, let's talk to that person first. I admire maybe the fact that you're open and that it seems like you're the type of Christian who I would enjoy having a conversation with. But I don't know how you go from science to God. How would you talk to them where they're at?
Well, the way I usually would start such a conversation would be that every person on the face of the earth is a person of faith. By that I mean you have to believe something that you can't prove. Now, I believe that there's a God. I can't prove it. Perhaps you believe there isn't a God, but you can't prove that either. I mean, that's been shown philosophically. You can't disprove God. So we're both people of faith. So if I'm a person that does science or trusts science or does it, what does that do for me to make me more likely to believe that there's a God? Over the years, there have been various proofs of God's existence, none of which really will convince anybody. There are the philosophical proofs. Thomas Aquinas had a number of those. The watchmaker proof, that's not really a proof. The most recent one, actually I'm reading a book about it right now, is the fine-tuning of the universe, where if there were four fundamental forces in the universe, and if one was tweaked just a little bit, we'd have a much different universe, probably not conducive to life. Is that a proof of God's? No, it really isn't. But to me, that they point in a particular direction, and then when I look at the universe, as the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 1, you look at this and you call it natural revelation. There's got to be something out there that's greater than I am, and I wonder who that could be. And I think to myself, God probably knew that we would think that way. How could I know? How could we know Him? So He decided He'd become one of us. That's the way it goes together for me.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. How about when it comes to people who are on the opposite side, who are maybe people who are listening, because we live in such a divided world right now that there's many things that divide us. This debate just being one of them, but you have the political debate you were talking about before, how politics gets dragged into so much of what we do, but it's especially in American society, we can talk as Americans in this, but what would you say for people who are like, of course I believe in God, but you just drop the E word and you say I should be trusting of science at the same time? How do I deal with that? For that segment of people
in the evangelical American church.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, science deals with facts, and you have to decide whether you want to believe in facts or not. It goes back to the authority question again. Who do you trust? Do you trust a person who is an authority? Let's say someone on a news show, who's an authority figure that will expound on certain things, and you trust that person, but they're not an expert. Do you trust the authority, or do you trust the expert? Do I trust a talking head on XYZ TV who's talking about genetics, or do I trust Francis Collins? And so you have to decide, I think, whether you believe in science. I can understand it when you get on an airplane. How can you believe the science that this 200-ton thing can fly? Right. I know the science behind it. How can I believe that? But we believe it all the time. We believe science all the time. Nobody questions photosynthesis. And not many people are debating whether the Earth is round or whether we circle around the sun. Not many people do that. Not many people even question quantum physics, whatever that is. But we question other things like evolution or COVID science or climate science. We question that. Why is that? Well, Dr. Janet Kellogg-Ray has a particular interesting take on that, and she believes it goes all the way back to the Scopes trial. She believes that it's rooted more in evolution that drives the rest of this. That was what made most of the doubt.
That is fascinating.
See, this sounds like it's part of the other podcast you want to do, which is How Did We Get There podcast.
Yeah,
we were just talking about this yesterday.
Well, honestly, I have to talk about this because I think what you just said is actually pretty profound. This
Profound? Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoa.
In the sense of distrusting science is pretty normal. I mean, family members, even when my wife and I were going to have a child, like looking at the healthcare system and how they do we had to really ask ourselves some of these questions, like, okay, which person is the expert, these types of things, and like, what is best for us? So there's like a real sense of like, okay, there's two different viewpoints. We've seen things that have hurt us. We've experienced things that have been helpful for us. But in a broad sense, this, even like, is it Galileo? Was he killed? The heliocentric model? I believe he was killed. Or?
No. He was just sent off into
sent off. He was banished.
Yeah.
But there, in America, in Western evangelical, it does feel like evolution was the impetus for distrusting the scientific world.
Yes.
And that kind of let the roots grow into other areas to when something that's new that comes up, we're going to jump on it and say no chance, or often. So is that what is her kind of take? Is that's where
that's her take on it. And I thought it was interesting that she goes back to the Scopes trial, 1925. And an interesting thing that I didn't know, and she said, in that trial, there was no science. There was no scientist that testified. There was no science at all. It was all about fear. It was all about fear. And the educating your children that we came from monkeys or whatever.
Right.
I don't know exactly, but and it was fear that started the whole thing. And fear of and now there's fear of authority. There's fear of the government's telling us what to do and so forth. Sometimes maybe that's a good fear. I don't know.
Right.
Well, it is distinctly American. It is unique that we're sitting in this space at this time, part of a culture that was founded on we don't trust authority. Like, essentially, stick it to authority. That's kind of, we have one of our most sacred holidays is Independence Day, right? We have, the Declaration of Independence. It's a very individualistic society.
Yes.
Maybe the most individualistic society of all time. And there are beautiful parts to living in that type of society, but it also comes with a shadow side in which there can be an underlying distrust of anything that has a sense of authority to it, or could be telling me anything that I should do with my life or anything I should believe. There's an automatic, I feel like the default is automatically distrust. Do you think that plays into it as well? I'm kind of using a little conjecture here. But
I think maybe it does with regard to some of the newer distrusts, like the COVID thing and climate science.
Yeah.
And I think there's the evolutionary debate, so to speak, has now gone more into the education wing of it, rather than in other words, you can't do this, or you can't do that, or you have to do this, you have to do that. So I don't know if we want to get on that rabbit hole or not, but
well, I do. I just want to bring it back to what we talked about trust and authority, right? It really is that. And I think for me, if I want to encourage anyone, it's just what I've found in my life is trusting in the one that's above it all, the one that kind of what you said is like, I can't give you the perfect argument to prove 100% shadow of a doubt God is real. It's this guy, you know. But it does seem that there's enough experiences that I've experienced in my own life. There's enough things that others have experienced and found and discovered. And when I put it all together, to me, there's an arrow. There's something pointing towards truth. And that's where I don't have faith in what I don't see just because I'm having blind faith. I have faith in what I don't see because of what I do see. And I think that is sometimes a piece that we forget about, or we expect others to, or people expect to be able to have, without a shadow of a doubt, no questions asked, or else I can't believe in anything. But I think there's almost a beauty to how God made us and how God made it all, where he actually invites us to have our own thoughts and use our own minds and use our own, use what we see in our relationships to have a say in what we believe, rather than, forcing us, without a shadow of a doubt to believe some of those things. I don't know. I think there's something actually beautiful about that.
Yeah, I do too. And as I just reflect on this, I think it's important for all of us just to acknowledge, first of all, our own biases that we bring into this conversation, our own subjective sense of, I may have been brought up this way, I may have been brought up this way, and to realize, okay, I think as Christians, one of the things we need to realize is if we're really placing our faith in God and we really believe all of these things are true about God, then we don't need to be afraid. As you were talking about, just the fact that, fear can drive so much of this discussion, and I don't think it needs to. I think we can have these discussions in a way that's fear doesn't have to control it.
I think that's true. I used to think many years ago, before really I think I'd read some of these books, what would happen if the scientists created some sort of living thing from non-living? I mean, I don't know if that'll ever happen, but what would that do to my faith? Or what would it do if we discovered that there were beings on some other planet? What would that do to my faith? And, I think no matter what we find out in science, it's not going to shake my faith because, science is God's gift to us. And what we find in science is going to be something that God made. And things change in science. I mean, sometimes you say, well, this assumption was wrong, and so we have to do this and that. But I don't think I'll be afraid of anything that science, and that's why that book, Coming to Peace with Science, was such a good book for me. It just gave me a lot of peace, and still does.
That's amazing. Well, for those of us that are watching online, or on YouTube, online, I don't know, too, whatever you're watching. If you're watching this in a visual form, put it that way, you'll see that Dr. Pelton has brought several books in, and you've been looking at them probably the whole time. I figured, why not give you a space to actually just reference them, talk about them, and share them with people who are curious. Like what might they? They're looking to explore a little bit in this area. What are some of the resources that you would suggest? Well,
I think for people that really aren't, excuse me, science people per se, and you want to find out about what science is like, this little book has a very quirky title. It's called The God of Monkey Science, and it's by Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray. It's a very good book to read. It's very readable, quick. You can read it in in a very short period of time. And it gives you a lot about what science is, some of the controversies, et cetera, et cetera. So I would recommend that, God of Monkey Science, if you want to read a book with that title. But the book that was very meaningful to me was Coming to Peace with Science by Dr. Daryl Falk. And again, he goes into the reasons for evolution and why it is true, et cetera, et cetera. So that was meaningful. The Language of God, which is really a classic by Dr. Francis Collins, goes into some of the genetic data as to why this is true, why evolution has been shown by genetic data to be true. I have two books, although there are many more, by John Walton, the scholar from Wheaton College. He's an Old Testament scholar, about Genesis. He's written one on the flood, but these are two that he's written on Genesis 1 and 2. The first is called The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton, and then the other one is The Lost World of Adam and Eve, which is Genesis 2, I believe. So those are very good to read. And the last one I just finished. This is a book by he's a physicist at Oxford, I think, Andrew Steen. It's called Faithful to Science, and that's this. He goes into a little bit more detail, and it's a little bit more philosophical, so it's a little bit tougher read than the others. But he has some really good points as to why science and faith are so compatible, and why science is God's gift to us. Wow. And I would just hope that people don't judge others' Christianity by how you view origins in Genesis 1. I mean, we can get along. We can get along, even if some of you are wrong. But we can get along, and we can be brothers and sisters in Christ. And really, that's the key thing here. I just don't think there should be these divisions that we see.
Wow. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Steve Pelton, for joining us on the Why God Why podcast. Feel free to check out. There's going to be more episodes on our Credibility of Christianity series. So be on the lookout for those, and we hope to catch your ear soon. There you go. All right. Have a good one.